I was in the middle of feeding my chickens when I heard it, a high-pitched, nasally voice screeching across my property like a banshee on a warpath. "Excuse me. Excuse me. You can't have those here." I turned around, and there she was, an angry middle-aged woman in a power suit that looked 3 sizes too tight, clutching a clipboard like it was a weapon. She stomped onto my land, nose wrinkled like she'd just stepped in something foul. "These animals violate HOA regulations," she snapped, pointing a manicured finger at my chickens, goats, and beehives. I wiped my hands on my jeans, barely suppressing a grin. "That's so. Absolutely. You are in clear violation, and I demand you remove them immediately." I let out a low whistle, looking around at my 10 acres of farmland, land that was legally zoned for agriculture, not part of her little HOA kingdom. She didn't know it yet, but she was picking a fight with the worst possible person. Still, I played dumb. "I don't think that's how it works." Her face turned an unnatural shade of red, eyes bulging as if I'd just spoken in some foreign language. "I make the rules here." That's when I knew. This woman was going to make it her life's mission to get rid of me. But what she didn't know: I'm a state agriculture inspector. This was going to be fun. The next morning, I stepped out onto my porch with a steaming mug of coffee, only to find half a dozen violation notices taped to my barn door. Each one was printed in bold, aggressive letters, listing out supposed infractions: unauthorized livestock, improper land use, environmental hazard. The last one had a handwritten note in angry red ink: final warning. Remove all animals within 7 days or face fines. I chuckled to myself. 7 days? Oh, she really thought she had power here. I had barely finished my coffee when I spotted movement near the fence. There she was again, Clipboard Karen, standing with 2 of her loyal HOA minions, whispering like they were orchestrating some grand neighborhood coup. She caught sight of me and stiffened. "Mr. Carter," she called out, her voice dripping with fake politeness. "I see you've received your notices." I walked over, deliberately slow, sipping my coffee. "Oh, I got 'em, all right. Pretty creative fiction." Her eyes narrowed. "This is not a joke. The HOA has strict guidelines that prohibit farm animals within the community." "Good thing I'm not in the community." Silence. Karen blinked. "What?" she spat. I gestured around. "My property is outside the HOA jurisdiction. Your rules don't apply here." For a moment, it looked like she might short-circuit. Her mouth opened and closed, as if her brain was desperately trying to process what I'd just said. Then, she rallied. "The HOA board has determined that your land visually impacts the aesthetic of the neighborhood, and therefore, we have the authority to enforce regulations on adjacent properties." I nearly spit out my coffee. What now?" She crossed her arms smugly. "Your animals are an eyesore. We have multiple complaints." I raised an eyebrow. "From who?" "That's confidential," she snapped. "But as HOA president, I have the right to take action." I had to give her credit, she had audacity. Too bad for her, I had actual legal authority. I let out a long sigh, feigning concern. "Wow. Sounds serious. Guess I better check if there are any agricultural violations." Karen's smugness faltered. "What?" I pulled out my state agriculture inspector badge and flipped it open. "You see, I'm not just a guy with a farm. I'm also the person who oversees compliance for real violations, and from what I've seen so far, this neighborhood is long overdue for an inspection." Karen's jaw dropped. Her minions looked like they wanted to disappear into the ground. That's ridiculous. You can't just inspect us," she sputtered. "Oh, I absolutely can. And since you're so concerned about regulations, I should probably start with your house." Her face drained of color. I gave her a friendly pat on the shoulder. "Don't worry. I'm sure you have nothing to hide, right?" She turned on her heel and stormed off, her minions trailing behind her. By the next morning, I was already receiving texts from some of my other neighbors. Apparently, Karen had spent the entire evening ranting at the HOA board, demanding emergency action. She was rallying the troops, determined to make my life a nightmare. I had to admit I was impressed by her commitment, but what she didn't realize was she had just started a war she couldn't win. That afternoon, I caught one of Karen's HOA enforcers, an old guy named Bob, trying to sneak onto my property with a measuring tape. I watched from my porch as he tiptoed toward my fence, looking around like a badly trained spy. "You need help there, Bob?" I called out. The poor guy jumped so high he nearly fell into my goat pen. I was just... I crossed my arms. "Trespassing?" Bob muttered something and scurried back toward the HOA-controlled neighborhood. It was clear they weren't going to stop. The next day, I received another violation notice. This one thicker than a phone book, with fines totaling over $10,000. I laughed so hard I nearly dropped it. I marched straight to the HOA office, kicked open the door, politely, of course, and slapped the stack of bogus fines onto the counter in front of Karen. "You might want to rethink this," I said, grinning. Karen glared at me, arms crossed. "The board has ruled. You must comply." I leaned in. "Did you actually research who I am?" She scoffed. "You're just some farmer." I slid my official state ID across the desk. "Wrong. I'm the guy who decides if you're breaking any laws." Her face turned a shade of white that would make a ghost jealous. And that's when I saw it, the flicker of panic in her eyes. Oh, this was about to get interesting. The HOA meeting was packed. Karen had rallied her loyal followers, most of them retirees with too much time on their hands, to demand action against me. The community hall buzzed with murmurs as Karen stood at the front, waving a stack of papers dramatically, like she was leading some kind of town rebellion. "We cannot allow livestock in our neighborhood," she declared, slamming a paper onto the table. "This is a civilized community. Chickens, goats, and beehives do not belong here. They bring disease, noise, and a complete lack of decorum." A few of her followers nodded in agreement, but most people looked more annoyed than concerned. Someone in the back muttered, "Didn't she try to ban front porch decorations last year?" Karen ignored the comment and pushed forward. "This is a direct violation of HOA regulations, and as president, I am demanding immediate enforcement action." I leaned back in my chair, stretching my arms. "Karen, did you ever bother to check the property lines before starting this little crusade?" She shot me a sharp look. "We have determined." "You haven't determined anything," I interrupted, pulling out a folder and tossing it onto the table. "See that? That's the county zoning map. My land isn't under HOA jurisdiction. Never was. Never will be." Karen's face twitched. "The board has reviewed." "No, Karen. You reviewed it. And you lied to them." The room fell silent. A few of the board members shifted uncomfortably. I could tell some of them were realizing, for the first time, that they might have been misled. Karen plastered on a tight-lipped smile. "Regardless of technicalities, the aesthetic of the community is at stake, and we have the right to enforce community standards." I raised an eyebrow. "Aesthetic? You mean like how your backyard shed was illegally expanded past zoning limits?" Karen's smile vanished. Murmurs rippled through the room. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the table. "See, Karen, you should have done your homework before picking a fight. As a state agriculture inspector, I don't just deal with farms. I also oversee zoning violations, land compliance, and property assessments. So while you were busy trying to bully me, I started looking into your little HOA empire." Karen's fingers curled around her clipboard so tightly I thought she might snap it in half. "Turns out," I continued, flipping through a few documents, "there's a lot of questionable stuff going on here. Like the misallocation of HOA funds. Like how you've been fining people for made-up violations that aren't in the actual bylaws. Like how you personally approved that illegal construction project on your own property without county permits." Karen's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. Someone in the back of the room chuckled. Another person whispered, "Wait, she what?" A board member, an older man with silver hair and thick glasses, cleared his throat. Karen, is this true? Karen snapped back to life. This is an outrageous personal attack. He's just trying to deflect from the real issue. He has livestock on community grounds. No, I have livestock on my personal farm. Meanwhile, you have a storage shed that encroaches onto a public easement, which is a finable offense. The murmurs grew louder. Karen's face turned red. This is harassment. I will not stand for this. You won't have to stand for anything, I said, flipping open another folder. Because I've filed an official request for a state audit on your HOA's financial records. Karen froze. The room went dead silent. Even the people who had been nodding along with her earlier were now staring at her, waiting for an explanation. Karen stammered. I shrugged. Guess we'll find out how that HOA money has really been spent. Should be interesting. Karen's hands shook. This is a disgrace. You're ruining this neighborhood. You don't belong here. I leaned back, letting a smirk creep onto my face. Karen, I'm not going anywhere. But I have a feeling you might be. The board members exchanged glances. The silver-haired man sighed. I think we need to review some things before we continue this discussion. Meeting adjourned. Karen looked like she wanted to scream. But she didn't. She just turned on her heel and stormed out, her little posse trailing after her. I watched her go, already knowing this fight wasn't over. The next morning, I wasn't surprised when the sheriff's department showed up at my gate. What did surprise me was that Karen was standing there with them, looking smug. An officer stepped forward, adjusting his belt. Sir, we received a complaint about illegal livestock and potential health code violations on this property. Karen folded her arms. I warned you. I smiled and pulled out my badge. Officer, I'm a state agriculture inspector. If there were any violations, I'd be the one enforcing them. The officer blinked. Karen's smile cracked. I gestured toward my animals. Go ahead. Take a look. Everything's perfectly legal. The officer exchanged a glance with his partner. They walked past Karen and started inspecting the property. After about 15 minutes, one of them came back, shaking his head. Everything's in order. No violations. Karen's face twisted. That's impossible. There must be something wrong. The officer sighed. Ma'am, this is a waste of police resources. Karen looked like she was about to explode. She turned to me, eyes blazing. You think you're untouchable, don't you? I shrugged. No. I just know the law better than you do. She clenched her jaw and stormed off without another word. As I watched her go, I realized something. She wasn't just angry. She was scared. Because for the first time, Karen was the one under the microscope. And she had no idea what was coming next. Karen had gone quiet. That was the first sign that something was about to go down. She wasn't the type to retreat, not unless she was planning something bigger. And sure enough, it didn't take long for her to make her next move. A week after the failed HOA meeting and the police visit, I got a certified letter in the mail. It was from the HOA's legal team, claiming that my farm was a public nuisance, and that they were pursuing legal action to have my animals removed. The sheer arrogance of it almost made me laugh. They had no jurisdiction over my land, no legal standing to enforce their ridiculous demands, but Karen was too stubborn to accept reality. I didn't waste time. I forwarded the letter straight to my attorney, a guy who had been dealing with overreaching HOAs for years. His response was immediate. They don't have a case. But if they want to play, we can play. That same day, I filed a formal complaint with the county, requesting a full audit of the HOA's financial record. If Karen wanted a war, I was more than happy to give her one. The next HOA meeting was packed, even more than the last one. Word had spread about the audit, and a lot of residents were now asking questions. Some of them had been suspicious about the way Karen ran things for years but had never spoken up, afraid of retaliation. Now that someone was challenging her, they weren't holding back. Karen was visibly tense, gripping the edge of the table as people fired off questions. Where had all the HOA fees gone? Why were fines being issued for things that weren't in the bylaws? Why was the HOA paying for legal consultations that no one had approved? Her excuses were weak. She tried to shift the blame, saying she was only following the best interests of the community, but no one was buying it anymore. The board members, the same ones who had backed her just a week ago, were now turning on her. Then came the bombshell. A representative from the county's legal department stood up and addressed the room. The audit had already uncovered multiple violations, including improper use of funds and unauthorized modifications to HOA rules. There were enough irregularities to warrant an official investigation. Karen's face went pale. She tried to argue to defend herself, but it was useless. The board held an emergency vote right then and there. She was removed as HOA president. Effective immediately. She stood up so fast that her chair nearly toppled over. "You can't do this to me. I built this HOA. I made this community what it is." A woman in the front row shook her head. "No, you made it a nightmare." Karen's eyes darted around the room, looking for support, but there was none. Even her most loyal followers had abandoned her. She turned to me, seething. "This is your fault." I smiled. "No, Karen. This is your fault." She stormed out, slamming the door behind her. But it wasn't over yet. With Karen gone, the HOA was now scrambling to fix the mess she had left behind. The new president, a reasonable guy named Frank, reached out to me personally. He apologized for everything that had happened and assured me that the HOA would no longer try to interfere with my property. I told him that was a good start. Then came the final twist. During the investigation, it was discovered that Karen herself had been violating HOA rules for years. She hadn't been paying her own HOA dues. She had unauthorized modifications on her property. She had even been collecting fines from residents and pocketing the money instead of depositing it into the HOA's account. The board wasted no time. They issued her fines, real ones this time, thousands of dollars worth. And when she refused to pay, they took legal action against her. A few weeks later, I saw a moving truck in front of her house. She was being evicted by the very HOA she had once ruled over. I watched from my porch as she loaded the last of her belongings into her car. She glanced up and saw me standing there. For a moment I thought she might say something. Maybe an apology. Maybe some final bitter remark. But she just turned away and got into her car. As she drove off, I couldn't help but smile. The war was over. And my farm animals? They were staying right where they belonged.